Chapter 1.
The kingdom of Aratol, more specifically the capital city, also named Aratol, was my father's birthplace. While most people recognized him by his Aratulian accent, few ever noticed his humble origins. My father was not one to boast unnecessarily, making it difficult for anyone to uncover his history. Yet those who witnessed his rise claim they were watching history in the making.
An excerpt from the Book of the Arcana by Josephine Spector. Year 598 AC. Month Lyriana. Location Kingdom of Aratol, capital city Aratol. The rooster's call pierced the stillness of dawn, heralding the arrival of another morning. Jason lay in his narrow bed in the barracks, groaning as the sound echoed relentlessly in his ears. This morning, the rooster seemed louder than usual, a fact that filled him with an all-too-familiar sense of dread. As his mind slowly emerged from the haze of sleep, Jason understood why. The noble squires in his year group had undoubtedly moved the rooster's nest to perch right above his window again. It was their favorite method of teaching obedience to the nobility, with dueling officially prohibited among squires, primarily because the nobles would lose most of those duels. This petty harassment had become their preferred alternative. Subtle annoyances and condescending displays of status were their weapons of choice, and an unspoken reminder of their superiority. Jason grimaced as he forced himself upright. His bed, barely more than a slab of wood, offered little comfort. A thin, threadbare blanket provided scant warmth against the biting chill of fall and winter. Like the rest of the common squires, Jason's clothing was plain and unremarkable, which was in stark contrast to the extravagant attire nobles could afford. From childhood, Jason had always preferred to sleep bare-chested. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but he didn't mind. The light grey trousers he wore sufficed to keep him fairly warm in the cold barracks. He exhaled deeply, watching a small cloud of breath dissipate in the frosty air. Reaching for his necklace, Jason instinctively checked that it was still around his neck. The pendant, an unusual mix of white at one end and light blue at the other, hung from an old strip of leather. It was the last gift his mother had given him before her mysterious disappearance when he was just 6 years old. Her parting words remained etched into his memory, as vivid now as they were then. If you let anyone see this, they will want to take it and then kill you. Hide it and guard it with your life. Do not let anyone see this. Of course, being as young as he was, Jason had lost the necklace once. Luckily, that was when his mentor first found him. Jason had been willing to fight a knight to retrieve it. His boldness and determination left a lasting impression on the elderly man. The knight, intrigued by Jason's willingness to defend what was his, decided to take him on as a squire. Jason agreed without hesitation, so long as the necklace was returned. True to his word, the knight handed it back, and Jason had served as his squire ever since. When Jason's mother left the family, it marked the hardest year of their lives in the slums of Aratol. She had spoken of finding a healer to help with the symptoms she'd been developing, but refused her husband's offer to accompany her, insisting she had to go alone. Left behind, Jason became the family's sole provider. He was the only one able to steal food and clothes for his younger sister, Tanya, and their father, Thomas. The memory of those days was etched deeply into his mind, holding his starving sister on the side of Aratol's roads, while their father, already weakened, sank further into despair. An injury at work left Thomas unable to earn a living, and the lack of purpose drove him to alcohol for solace. Tanya was the first to die, during one of the harshest winters Aratol had seen in years. The cold ruined crops, leading to a devastating food shortage. To make matters worse, corrupt city officials and guards ensured the nobility hoarded more than they needed, often resorting to brutalizing smaller families to take their supplies. Despite these hardships, the cruelty of the guards forged an unshakable bond within the slums. Families supported each other however they could, often through theft. Jason's mother had taught him the basics of stealing before she left, occasionally sending him out with an empty stomach to steal food for survival. But even with the help of their neighbors, it wasn't enough. Tanya's health quickly deteriorated from malnourishment and the relentless cold, and she passed away not long after. Thomas fared little better, though Jason's mentor assisted him when Jason began his journey as a squire. However, the years of hardship had taken a brutal toll on his father. Frail and despondent, Thomas clung to the bottle, a habit that eventually led to his death last winter. Jason wasn't there when he heard the news of his father's passing. As a squire, he was required to live in the barracks throughout his training, cut off from the outside world, except for rare breaks. It's all part of the lessons and traditions passed down by the knights before you, his mentor had explained when Jason once questioned this custom. After that, Jason stopped asking such questions. He learned to focus on finding the lessons hidden in every hardship, determined to absorb whatever wisdom he could. Even though life in the barracks wasn't as luxurious as the accommodations for noble-born squires, Jason was content. The thin blanket on his small bed was more than he could have hoped for compared to the streets. Sure, the noble squires flaunted their private rooms and cozy living quarters, but Jason didn't care. Their bragging wasn't exactly pleasant, but if tolerating it was the price to stay here, away from the brutality of city guards and the hunger of the slums, it was one he'd gladly pay. Stretching his back until it cracked pleasantly, Jason pulled on his worn shoes and headed toward the kitchen. The faint hum of activity greeted him as young servants bustled through the early morning shadows, preparing warm meals for the barracks. Jason was grateful not to be among them. The kitchen boys had little freedom, bound by repetitive and often dull tasks. Still, he appreciated their work and always made a point to thank them. The kitchen wasn't far from his modest room, and Jason reached the dining hall before anyone else. As he opened the door, the comforting aroma of warm porridge wafted over him. A boy with dirty blonde hair and a cleaning rag tucked into his belt darted toward him, a sheepish grin lighting up his face. "Good morning, Squire Jason," the boy greeted, his voice light with excitement. "Good morning, Milton," Jason replied, suppressing a yawn as he patted the boy's head on his way past. "What's with that grin of yours?" "Oh, nothing. I just had a bet with Brad that you'd be the first one here," Milton said, his grin widening. Jason smirked slightly. Milton and Brad were both orphans like himself, and their endless bets were as amusing as they were trivial. On occasion, Jason even joined in their games for the fun of it, though he tended to win the bets he joined. "And what did you win this time?" Jason asked, heading toward the kitchen door that connected to the dining hall. "Oh, just an additional piece of bread," said Milton. Jason chuckled softly. "Just don't take all his food. I'd hate to see the two of you fighting over scraps." Milton nodded earnestly, his gratitude for his role at the barracks apparent in every movement. "I won't." Jason gave him a tired smile before pushing through the kitchen door. The warm scent of porridge enveloped him, making his stomach rumble in anticipation. The kitchen, though modest, was like heaven to him. Amid the sea of stoves and steaming pots, Jason spotted Brad assisting Chef Haynes. With a grin, he strolled over and gave the boy a playful tap on the back of the head. "Hey, what was that for?" Brad exclaimed in a high-pitched voice, spinning around to glare at Jason. "It seems you owe Milton a piece of your bread today, hey?" Jason said, his grin widening. Brad, dressed in the same stained uniform as Milton, frowned. The two boys shared similar features: round faces, sharp noses, and perpetual smudges of dirt from their kitchen duties. Despite their hard work, Jason knew they'd never developed the physical strength and sharp features typical of squires. It was an unfair reality, but one Jason had long accepted. Chef Hennis, who was stirring a pot of porridge nearby, paused to cross his muscular arms, his expression as gruff as his appearance. He could easily rival the barracks soldiers in arm wrestling, though his round belly would keep him from excelling in much else. His white chef's uniform was a patchwork of stains, blood, oil, and flour from countless meals. With his scruffy beard and large frame, Haynes resembled a bear, albeit one better suited to wielding a ladle than claws. "You bet food again?" Haynes asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. Brad's bravado faltered as he looked down, but he quickly straightened up, his pride intact. "Yes, sir. We don't have much else to wager besides food," he said. Haynes shook his head, clearly tired of the same conversation he'd had countless times. "How about this? Next time, don't bet on the obvious. You might actually win once in a while," he grumbled, returning to the porridge with a practiced stir. Jason chuckled softly, watching the exchange. Milton and Brad could easily pass as brothers, though no one truly knew if they were related. At times, Jason felt like the older sibling of the group, with the chefs acting as exasperated parents who had no idea how to handle mischievous children. Haynes broke Jason's thoughts. "Anyway, Jason, you here for your meal?" "Yes, sir," Jason replied. "I asked Sir Gallen for additional sparring practice before the tournament tomorrow." At the mention of the tournament, Jason's heart quickened. The event loomed large in his mind, a test of his skills and a chance to prove himself not only to Sir Gallen, but to the entire barracks and the kingdom. The tournament was held annually, just before the season's first snowflakes signaled the arrival of winter. For Jason, this year marked his first time participating, as only squires with at least 2 years of training were eligible. The recommended age range for participants was 15 to 18, ensuring the competition was fierce and filled with eager young fighters. But Jason's motivation for joining wasn't the prize, 100 gold pieces for the winner. The prospect of wealth barely interested him. He wouldn't even know what to do with such a sum. What Jason truly wanted was the challenge, the opportunity to spar against opponents with diverse fighting styles. It was a chance to learn, and that was worth far more to him than gold. The tournament was more than just a competition. It was a grand event that drew citizens from across the neighboring lands to the bustling city of Aratul. With them came squires from distant regions, each bringing unique techniques and skills honed under different masters. The tournament victor would receive not only gold, but also high praise from the monarch of Aratul, an honor that carried immense prestige. This year was particularly special because the princess had turned 16, an age that made her the center of attention for ambitious squires and noblemen, eager to seek her hand in marriage. Jason had no interest in such matters, but he understood the stakes and the added pomp this year's event would bring. Jason also knew how fortunate he was to have Sir Gallen as his mentor. Thanks to the knight's connections, Jason had access to the exclusive training hall, a privilege that few others shared. As he prepared to meet Sir Gallen for another intense session, his excitement grew. "Ah, poor Sir Gallen," Hennis said, his smile barely visible beneath his thick beard. "Sometimes it seems like you're the one pushing the old man to his limits, not the other way around." Jason scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "Yeah, that might be true," he admitted. It wasn't uncommon for him to challenge his mentor, a trait that set him apart from many of his peers who were content with the bare minimum. Brad, who had been listening intently, piped up with wide eyes. "What'll you do with the gold when you win the tournament, Jason?" Jason chuckled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Win? I doubt I'll even make it to the semi-finals," he said with a grin. "But if by some miracle I do win, I'll make sure you, Milton, and the rest of the staff get a little something as thanks. Maybe even some new clothes for you two. And I'd use the rest to help those who helped me before I came here. No sense in keeping all that money for myself when others need it more." Brad's eyes grew even wider, and Jason feared they might pop right out of his head. "That's kind of you, Squire," came a voice from behind. Jason turned to see Chef Dixon, Haines's younger brother, leaning casually against the doorframe. "But trust me, these boys don't need new clothes. They're just too lazy to clean up after themselves." Dixon's resemblance to Haines was uncanny, though he lacked the bushy beard his brother wore. His grin was more mischievous, but his demeanor was just as gruff. Jason laughed. Well, maybe a good scrubbing and some soap would be enough then. Dixon chuckled, shaking his head. Good luck convincing them of that. Dixon carried 2 bowls and spoons, setting them on the kitchen counter beside Haines's steaming pot. It was clear they were for Jason and Sir Gallen, prepared with the same care that the head chefs showed everyone under their roof. "Please, it's the least I can do to repay you for all the kindness you've shown me," Jason said earnestly. The head chefs had always been compassionate, especially toward those born into less fortunate circumstances. It wasn't uncommon for them to hand out leftover meals to the orphans wandering the streets. Without people like Haines and Dixon, Jason might not have survived the harsh winters of his youth. Jason had plans to give back, though. He'd been dreaming of funding a greenhouse for the slums, a project that could provide food and employment, making the community more self-sufficient. Matthias, a respected figure in the slums, would oversee the effort. Jason trusted him to manage the funds far better than he could, and he still kept in touch to offer help whenever he could. Dixon gave Jason a hearty pat on the back, smiling warmly. "You're a good lad. A shame not many nobles share your gratitude or your sense of responsibility." Jason offered an optimistic grin. "Well, at least we can lean on each other for support." Dixon nodded. "That we can." With that, he returned to his duties, leaving Haines to ladle generous portions of porridge into the bowls. Haines slid them toward Jason, placing a spoon in each one, and smiled in a fatherly way. "All right, boy, get out there and train for tomorrow. I expect you to kick some ass. We'll be rooting for you," he said with a chuckle. "And send our regards to Sir Gallen, would you?" Jason laughed and thanked him before taking the bowls. He left the kitchen and stepped into the dining room, only to spot a familiar face entering from the opposite door. The young squire, who was Jason's age, had dirty blonde hair and a wiry frame. While he lacked the muscle mass Jason had built over years of relentless training, his agility and speed made him a formidable opponent for anyone foolish enough to underestimate him. Though the squire had started his training a year after Jason, they had grown close over time. Jason trusted him implicitly, knowing he'd always have his back in a fight. He wasn't just a comrade in arms, he was Jason's best friend. "What's up, Jason?" The squire greeted him, his dark green eyes bright with mischief as a smile spread across his face. "Hey, Connor, how you holding up?" Jason asked, returning the smile. Jason was almost a head taller than the young squire in front of him, standing around 5 feet 9 inches compared to Connor's 5 feet 7 inches. Can't complain. The rooster is closer again," Connor said as he sat down at one of the tables. "Yeah, I noticed. It was right outside my window this morning. The group of nobles probably moved its nest there again," Jason replied, not too bothered. "I swear, If they weren't nobility, I'd return the favor, Connor grunted, letting out a long yawn. Jason grinned. Well, maybe you'll get your chance to return the favor tomorrow at the tournament. Is it Suncrest already? Connor asked, groaning. Shit, that means I have to help the blacksmith today. He let his head drop onto the table with a thud. Let's just hope Ferran goes easy on you today, considering tomorrow's event, Jason said, with a smirk as he headed for the exit. Blacksmith Ferran was known for demanding hard labor from the squires who helped out in his forge. Even noble-born squires took him seriously, which said a lot about his reputation. You heading out to practice with Sir Gallen? Connor asked, lifting his head slightly. You bet, Jason replied as he stepped through the doorway. He heard Connor shout, "Good luck," before he turned down the corridor leading to the mentor's quarters. Jason had walked the halls of the barracks so many times that he could navigate them blindfolded without running into walls. Milton and Brad had once bet that he couldn't do it, wagering that he'd hit the walls at least 5 times. Naturally, they lost, and Jason enjoyed a dinner plate that night, piled so high it nearly overflowed. Several servants were already hard at work in the halls, and Jason greeted them all with cheerful smiles, wishing them a good day. Sir Gallen's room stood behind a large wooden door, intricately engraved by a master craftsman. Jason never failed to admire the piece of art, and could easily spend hours studying it during his rare free moments. But he reminded himself he had requested the additional training session and needed to hurry. Carefully balancing the bowls of porridge, Jason knocked on the heavy oak door, ensuring nothing spilled. He waited for the familiar "come in," then stepped into his mentor's quarters. The room was spacious, with a comfortable bed and a fireplace for extra warmth. However, it lacked the opulence one might expect of a noble's quarters. No gold trimmings, elaborate paintings, or oversized plants. Sir Gallen had always insisted on modest accommodations, believing that understanding how his subordinates lived made him a better leader. It was that trait that Jason respected most in Sir Gallen, his understanding and kind-hearted nature, which was a rarity among the nobility. Sir Gallen was already seated at the room's small table next to the fireplace, his posture relaxed despite the early hour. "What took you so long, Jason?" Sir Gallen asked, his voice warm with a touch of amusement. He had changed from his nightgown into more practical clothing suited for combat. Jason grimaced as he realized he was still wearing his regular clothes. "I'm sorry, Sir Gallen. There's quite a bit of excitement in the barracks kitchen this morning," Jason explained as he placed the bowl of porridge in front of his mentor. "Relax, boy. I'm just joking," Sir Gallen said with a smirk. "I know how Haynes and Dixon are. They're like father figures to the kids in the kitchen, even though they don't tolerate too many pranks." Jason nodded, knowing exactly what Sir Gallen meant. Haynes and Dixon had a reputation for being strict, but caring to those under their roof. "Yes, sir, they are," Jason said. "Also, they send their regards, sir." He waited patiently for his mentor to begin eating before starting on his own portion. Sir Gallen nodded, taking the first bite of porridge. "Thanks, Jason. Will you return the favor when you bring the bowls back?" he asked, his voice muffled as he chewed. "Of course, sir. I'm sure they'll be pleased," Jason said with a grin. They sat in companionable silence for a time, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the porridge, the flickering flames casting soft light across the room. Once Sir Gallen finished his breakfast, he wiped his mouth with a cloth and looked up at Jason. "You seem awfully calm for someone entering the tournament for the first time," he observed. "Not at all, sir," Jason replied, glancing up from his bowl. "I'm pretty frightened and excited about tomorrow." If that's the case, then you can hide your emotions pretty well. Sir Gallen said, nodding with approval. That's good. In combat, hiding your emotions from your enemy keeps you in control, allowing you to maintain the upper hand. I know, Jason said with a slight smile. It's the first lesson you ever taught me, Sir Gallen. Reading your opponent lets you assess the situation better, increasing your chances of victory. If you can read their emotions, you can predict their moves. Sir Gallen nodded again, the approval evident in his eyes. Very well, Jason, Sir Gallen said. I see you remember that lesson quite well. I do, sir, along with every other lesson, Jason replied as he finished his bowl. What will our training focus on today? Basics, boy, Sir Gallen said with a firm tone. Jason frowned slightly. He had hoped to learn a new technique or skill before the tournament started. Sir Gallen raised a hand, cutting off any protest Jason might have. Teaching you anything new now will only slow you down and confuse you, Sir Gallen continued. Your brain will try to incorporate the new technique into what you've already mastered, making you uncertain. You need time to absorb what you learn before adding more to your arsenal. After the tournament, I'll teach you new skills. That's a promise. I understand, sir, Jason said. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to keep his excitement in check. He had to focus on what he already knew. Sir Gallen stood and stretched his back. All right, Jason, take the bowls back to the kitchen, put on your training clothes, and meet me in the training hall. I'll be waiting for you in 5 minutes. If you're any later, you'll be running 5 rounds around the castle's inner gates. Jason immediately stood and gave a quick bow. Yes, sir. He rushed out of the room, one bowl in each hand. Sir Gallen watched him go, shaking his head. Hopefully, his enthusiasm doesn't get him killed. The boy's good, with a blade and a bow, but that eagerness to learn isn't always well received, and people don't always like that, he muttered to himself. Sir Gallen turned to the closet next to the door, retrieving a jacket and warm shoes lined with sheep's wool to keep himself warm on the way to the training hall. Jason arrived at the training hall just in time. He had managed to return the bowls to the kitchen, thank the chefs on Sir Gallen's behalf, avoid any conflict with the nobles, something he'd feared might happen, and change into his training clothes without delay. He wore the standard squire's uniform, a light grey tunic, dark grey pants, and the squire's symbol on the left chest piece. The emblem, a sword pointing upwards encircled by a ring of vines, was woven into the fabric with gold thread, making it easily recognizable. Every squire also wore a silver ring on their index finger, engraved with the same symbol, marking their rank and commitment. There were 2 guards in full metal armor standing on either side of the training hall's entry door. Jason immediately recognized the armor and knew there would be more of them inside the hall. The armor was primarily grey, with delicate gold lines accenting the edges. Both guards wore red shoulder capes and gripped halberds in one hand. Their under-armor tunics had a subtle tint of purple, mirroring the nation's colors. As Jason approached, the guards tensed, ready for any movement. He knew that even on his best day, defeating these guards would be nearly impossible. The king's guards were among the best of the best, faster and more skilled than even Sir Gallen. Who walks there? One of them demanded, his voice sharp. Jason might have been frightened if he had been a smaller child, but as a squire, the harsh tone didn't intimidate him. In fact, it could probably scare an ogre away. Squire Jason, sir. Sir Gallen has instructed me to meet him in the training hall, Jason said, standing tall with respect. Show me your ring, the other guard ordered. Jason immediately presented the silver ring, and the first guard nodded in recognition. Stay here, he said, then opened the door and vanished behind it. The wait felt like an eternity before the guard returned, nodding to his companion before turning his attention back to Jason. "You're Sir Galen's squire, eh?" he asked. Jason nodded firmly. "Yes, sir." "Very well, you may enter," the guard said, holding the door open for Jason to pass. As he walked inside, Jason's nerves surged, his palms grew sweaty, and his heart raced so fast he feared it might burst. Upon entering the hall, he was greeted by another pair of royal guards, identical to the first. They escorted him to the center of the vast training hall, which was mostly empty except for a few targets for bows and crossbows at the far end. Along the opposite side of the hall were racks filled with wooden training weapons and blunt steel swords. The large windows let in natural light, but candles hung from the ceiling to illuminate the room when the daylight faded. Jason's eyes were drawn to the center of the hall, where his mentor stood, flanked by the Crown Prince, his younger brother, and the king himself. "Ah, Jason, there you are," Sir Galen said calmly. He appeared unfazed by the presence of the monarch, completely at ease. Meanwhile, Jason focused on not tripping over his own feet. The three nobles turned to face him as he nervously approached the circle of men. "Is this the boy you've been training, Kren?" King Viggo Lionheart asked. The monarch wore a thick red coat trimmed with white fur, and his gold crown rested perfectly on his head of white hair. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, and the king's clean-shaven face was framed by sharp, dark eyes that seemed to pierce through Jason as he stood there. "Yes, Your Majesty, he is my pride and joy," Sir Galen replied. Jason could see that his mentor's words were sincere, the pride evident in his posture and steady expression. "So you say," the king responded. "What is your name, squire?" "My name is Jason, Your Majesty," Jason said, forcing himself to maintain composure despite his racing heart, while bowing awkwardly. He had never interacted with anyone of higher rank than the knights in the barracks. "Jason, huh?" The king raised an eyebrow. "What about your family name?" Jason hesitated. The question caught him off guard, and for the first time, the absence of a surname felt painfully real. I do not have one, Your Majesty," he replied, feeling the awkwardness settle deep in his chest. It had never seemed important before, but standing in front of the monarch, Jason suddenly felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing a vital piece. "I see," the king said thoughtfully, his gaze softening. "So, you are not born of noble blood, then?" The question stung. It felt like a slap to the face. Jason's throat tightened, and he kept his eyes on the floor, afraid to look up. He simply nodded in silence. "That is fine," the monarch said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I am not a ruler bound by the old ways like my father was. If you can prove yourself with the blade and help strengthen the army protecting this city, I welcome your service. Most of the nobles do not agree with my philosophy, but they fail to understand that it is the poor and the peasants who truly keep the city running." Jason was taken aback. He had always heard stories of nobles being selfish and corrupt, but here was a monarch, his monarch, who seemed different. His kindness, or at least the sincerity behind it, made Jason rethink everything he'd been told. The king's words were not what Jason expected from someone of his station. He swallowed hard before speaking again. "Thank you, sire. Your words mean a lot. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Then don't say anything. It makes you look more intelligent," the monarch said with a slight, reassuring smile. Jason looked up at him, grateful for the king's easy manner. He quickly bowed his head again in respect. He would gladly serve a king like this. "Father, may I please?" one of the younger men asked. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of determination in it. He wore a black leather tunic beneath a warm winter coat, and his dark eyes, like the king's, were set against his dark brown hair. The monarch gave a slight nod, allowing the young man to step forward. He was about Jason's height and appeared to be a few years older, perhaps 2 or 3. The young man gave Jason a friendly nod as a greeting. "I am Prince George Lionheart," he said, his voice steady but with a touch of curiosity. It was only then that Jason noticed the sword strapped to the prince's side. It was mostly hidden beneath his coat, but Jason recognized the familiar outline of the sheath and blade. Jason bowed his head more deeply this time, instinctively feeling the weight of the prince's presence. "As the next in line for the throne," the prince continued, "I am ordered to learn as much as possible about the people I will one day rule, their personalities, their culture." He sighed, his gaze thoughtful, before taking a deep breath. "Squire Jason, will you be willing to participate in a duel with me?" Jason's jaw dropped. The prince wanted to duel him. His eyes widened in shock, and before he could stop himself, his mouth hung open in disbelief. As soon as he realized his mistake, he snapped it shut, his gaze flicking to Sir Galan, unsure of how to respond. He never would have expected the prince to ask something like this, but his mentor wore a stern expression and nodded in approval. Swallowing hard, Jason finally found his voice. "Of course, my prince. It would be an honor," he said, though a knot tightened in his stomach. He understood the prince's desire to learn. The prince wanted to test himself against a peasant, someone trained under one of the most respected knights in the kingdom. But Jason couldn't shake the discomfort in his chest. He didn't want to hurt him. Worse, what if there were consequences for injuring the prince? "No need to worry about any consequences for hurting me," Prince George said, as if reading Jason's mind. "In the ring, there's no such thing as noble or peasant. Just 2 people with swords, that's all." "How did you know that was on my mind?" Jason asked, astonished. "It's written all over your face," the prince chuckled. "Also, it's a reasonable fear, especially for someone without noble rank. But don't worry, nothing will happen to you if you beat me. I doubt I could even best Sir Galan on a good day." Jason couldn't help but grin. "I understand, my prince," he said, bowing deeply. The guards closest to the prince swiftly removed his cloak and sword, and a ring was formed in the center of the training hall for the duel. 2 more guards moved to the weapon stand, selecting shields and swords, and handed them to the combatants. Jason studied the prince closely. The way he prepared himself, how he moved, every gesture seemed deliberate. But there was something about his expression that intrigued Jason. The prince held the sword well, and Jason could tell he was skilled enough to use it properly if the need arose. But his movements weren't fluid or practiced in the way of someone who had spent years honing the art of combat. The prince's technique was basic, yet sharp enough to show potential. What made Jason pause, however, was the prince's expression. Unlike the many opponents Jason had faced in the dueling ring, the prince's thoughts were unreadable. It caught him off guard, a feeling of unease settling in his stomach. Jason had faced warriors, knights, and squires, each with their own unique tics and habits that he could read easily. But Prince George, Jason couldn't even tell if he was nervous, confident, or uncertain. "What is it, Squire?" the prince asked, noticing Jason's lingering gaze. Jason snapped his attention back to the present, standing tall and focused, his shield and sword hanging loosely by his side, ready for whatever came next. "You don't seem to be comfortable with the shield," the prince remarked, his tone casual but observant. Jason looked down at the shield in his hand and smiled slightly. "You're correct. I don't particularly enjoy fighting with a shield," he admitted. Without a second thought, he tossed it aside, the wooden shield clattering to the ground. The sword he held, though not a perfect fit, was long enough to be considered a longsword, but light enough to wield with one hand, a more familiar choice for Jason. The prince's brow furrowed for a brief moment, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before it was gone, replaced by his usual composed expression. Jason couldn't help but grin, his confidence growing. He spun the sword in his hand once, feeling its weight, and then assumed his preferred combat stance, ready for anything. "On my mark," Sir Galen's voice cut through the air, firm and commanding. "Go." Jason didn't rush in. He stayed defensive, taking slow, calculated steps. The prince seemed to adopt a similar strategy, neither of them engaging directly at first. Jason circled to the left, keeping a close eye on the prince's movements. The prince mirrored him exactly, maintaining their distance with precision. They moved in synchronization, each attempting to outflank the other. Jason shifted his position again, reversing direction. The prince, too, mirrored the change. It was a game of patience, testing one another for weaknesses, for signs of hesitation. Jason was impressed by the prince's footwork. He moved with surprising grace, almost as though he'd been trained well. But something about his stance felt off. Jason could see it. His footwork, though competent, didn't have the endurance of someone who regularly trained in combat. Jason suspected the prince didn't spend hours in the ring like he did. Maybe he thought his status alone would be enough to win him any duel. Jason's eyes flicked to the shield, which the prince was struggling to keep up. It wasn't just the shield that gave him this impression. It was the prince's overall posture, the slight imbalance in his movements. Perhaps the prince had faced opponents who gave up halfway through the duel because they didn't wish to hurt the prince. That would simply grant the prince a false victory, which did little good for the prince when it comes to the arts of combat. But Jason wouldn't give him that luxury. He couldn't afford to. Not after the prince had spoken with such sincerity about learning. Jason respected that. He wouldn't stoop to a false victory. He wanted to meet the prince with the same determination, the same desire to prove himself. Jason lunged forward, a swift jab with his wooden sword aimed low at the prince's legs. The attack came suddenly, catching the prince off guard. He fumbled to lower his shield in time, but it was clumsy and slow, barely intercepting the strike. Had Jason been watching from the sidelines, he would have grinned at the prince's misstep. But as it was, he recognized the trap too well, one he had fallen into countless times during training with Sir Galen. A feint to the legs often threw an opponent off balance, disrupting their footwork and leaving them vulnerable. An enemy off balance is mostly a dead enemy, Sir Galen had always drilled into him during their sparring sessions, especially when Jason had lost his own balance. To this day, Jason worked relentlessly on his footwork. After all, a solid stance was the foundation for every attack and defense. Taking advantage of the prince's faltering, Jason shifted his focus from the legs to the throat in a seamless, practiced motion. With the prince's shield still low and only one hand on his sword, Jason had all the leverage he needed to deliver a devastating blow. The prince tried to raise his shield in defense, but Jason had already anticipated his reaction. The prince's lack of physical strength became evident as the shield barely made it halfway up. Jason, strong and quick, relied more on agility and precision than on defense. The shield, while protective, had never felt as natural to him as his swift, two-handed strikes. With a clean arc, Jason brought his sword down, the weight of the blow too much for the prince's feeble defense. The wooden sword clashed against the prince's blade with a sharp whack, sending it flying from his grasp to the ground 2 meters away. Jason didn't stop there. He continued his strike with ruthless precision, landing a solid blow to the prince's jaw with a resounding thud. The prince collapsed to the ground, momentarily stunned, while Jason stood tall, immediately slipping back into a defensive stance. "Halt!" Sir Galen's voice rang out, firm and commanding. Jason froze in place, his heart racing as the realization of what he had just done finally hit him. Sir Galen's lessons had always emphasized that hesitation in battle could cost dearly. But it was only now that Jason understood the full weight of the consequences, especially when the person he had struck was royalty. I am so sorry," Jason stammered, his voice laced with panic. I didn't mean..." The prince, still on the ground, raised a hand to silence him. "No need to apologize, Squire," he said, his tone surprisingly calm as he pushed himself to his feet. He dropped the shield and began massaging his jaw, wincing slightly. "You've only done what was asked of you." Jason exhaled in relief when he saw that the prince's jaw wasn't broken. The blow had landed hard, but fortunately, the prince seemed to have only sustained a bruise. The area was already darkening, a blue-black mark that would linger for a couple of days at least. "That was quite the feint, Squire," the prince remarked, his voice tinged with genuine admiration. "You caught me off guard." "I could tell," Jason replied, a grin forming without him thinking. For a brief moment, he forgot who he was speaking to. It felt as though Prince George was someone he could be himself around, no pretensions, no fear of royal backlash. To Jason, the prince was just another young man, doing his best with the hand he'd been dealt, someone with ambitions not far removed from Jason's own. How so? The prince's curiosity was piqued, and there was a spark in his eyes. Jason shrugged, feeling more relaxed. "It didn't take long for me to notice that your left arm is too weak to wield a shield properly. You were holding it too low for a solid defense. And once I saw that, I figured if I knocked it down, you wouldn't have enough time to block a horizontal strike." The prince's smirk deepened. "You're the first person to say that to my face," he said, the smile growing just a fraction. "All my mentors and opponents in the ring always sugarcoat the truth." Jason hesitated, scratching the back of his head. He wasn't used to speaking so plainly, especially not to someone of the prince's stature. The prince waved it off. "I appreciate your honesty in the duel," he said, extending his hand toward Jason. Jason hesitated for a moment, unsure of the proper response, but then grasped the prince's hand firmly. It was soft, lacking the strength he'd expected from someone who wielded a sword, a clear indication of the prince's inexperience in combat. "It was my honor, my prince," Jason replied, his voice steady despite the nerves he felt. Sir Galen's voice broke the moment. "So what do you think, Your Majesty?" Jason froze, suddenly aware of all the eyes upon him. 6 royal guards, the 2 princes, Sir Galen, and of course, the king himself. The monarch studied Jason with a thoughtful expression. "He surprised me, that's for sure," he said, eyes narrowing as he took in the young squire. "You've exceeded my expectations, Cren." "Thank you, sire," Sir Galen said, bowing in acknowledgement. The king's gaze shifted to his eldest son, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I think he'll do well as a training partner for young George." Jason blinked, confusion quickly overtaking him. "Training partner," he echoed, his voice betraying his confusion. Sir Galen chuckled softly. "Ah, yes. The king wanted me to mentor young Prince George. But as the knight's order forbids knights from having more than one squire at a time, this was a test to see if you're capable of teaching the young prince swordplay yourself. Jason felt his heart skip a beat at the mention of training the prince. His mouth went dry, and for a few moments, all he could do was stare in stunned silence, as though the ground had shifted beneath him. I don't know what to say, Jason stammered, his thoughts racing. I'm honored you think I'm ready, Sir Gallen. I'll do my best, he added more confidently, bowing deeply to both the prince and the king. The monarch's expression softened. It was a shame that Sir Gallen already had a squire when I first asked him to train my son, he said, placing a fatherly hand on Jason's shoulder. But I'm glad he refused. He's raised a fine young man, noble or not. Jason felt the weight of the monarch's words and wondered what kind of man he would become in the king's eyes. A servant will fetch you for the first week of training, the king continued. And after that, you'll need to be punctual on your own. Of course, your other duties come first. I trust you know what that means. Yes, sire, Jason replied, standing tall and maintaining a stern expression. So, does that mean Sir Gallen is no longer my mentor? His voice was calm, but there was a quiet unease underneath. He knew the answer, but hearing it out loud still felt like an irreversible shift. Yes, you are correct, the monarch said, his tone decisive. You are no longer bound by duty to Sir Gallen, but you will not be knighted until you turn 18 years old. Jason nodded, accepting the information, even though a part of him felt like he was losing something precious. It is all right, Jason. I have nothing left I can teach you, Sir Gallen said with a proud smile. You are the best squire I could have asked for, and you're the only one to ever learn as quickly as you did. There was a warmth in Sir Gallen's words that filled Jason with gratitude. Jason bowed his head, a mixture of respect and emotion clouding his thoughts. Thank you, Sir Gallen, he said softly, his voice catching just a little. He paused, the weight of the moment pressing on him, before he spoke again. It's been an honor. Right then, the monarch said, clapping his hands together to break the moment. Squire, I wish you good luck for tomorrow's tournament. He gave Jason a nod of encouragement before turning to Sir Gallen. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have other matters to attend to. The king extended a firm handshake to Sir Gallen, who returned it with a bow. The royal guards flanked the monarch as they exited the training hall. But just before they left, Prince George called over his shoulder. Good luck, Squire. I'll place a bet on you tomorrow. He winked at Jason, then disappeared behind the door with the rest of the royal family. Jason stood frozen for a moment, still processing everything. Sir Gallen placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice fatherly. You've done well, my boy. Jason looked up at his mentor, his mind swirling with new information. Sir Gallen, he began, his curiosity piqued. The king called you by your first name. Why is that? He seems to know you pretty well. Sir Gallen chuckled, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yes, indeed. He was my apprentice before you, Jason, he explained. He looks older than he is. The weight of ruling a kingdom has that effect. He was your apprentice? Jason asked in surprise. The idea of the monarch once being under Sir Gallen's tutelage seemed strange, yet somehow fitting. Yes, indeed, Sir Gallen confirmed, a soft chuckle escaping him. He was a complicated brat back then, but he's grown into a fine man. Sir Gallen's smile was filled with both pride and amusement. He's not perfect, but he's better than I ever thought he'd be. Jason thought about that for a moment. That explains his views regarding the lower-born people, he mused aloud. Pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place. Sir Gallen nodded. Yes, thanks to my teachings, He understands what it's like to live at the bottom of the food chain, to survive in the slums, to hear firsthand what the peasants think of the nobility. His voice grew thoughtful. He took that lesson to heart, and I'm proud of him for it. The city is better for it, but the court, the nobles fear they'll lose their wealth. Politics is a battlefield, Jason. Even I'm terrified to enter it. Jason absorbed Sir Galen's words, trying to understand the delicate balance of power and influence. The political world was a far cry from the straightforward battles he was used to. I see, Jason said, his voice quieter now, as he replaced his own equipment on the wall. I'm surprised to hear that you're afraid of anything, Sir Galen. Sir Galen chuckled again, his eyes twinkling with humour. There are only two things that truly terrify me, my boy, he said. Politics and women. Women, Jason repeated, puzzled by the response. He had spent some time with women in the city, and while some could be intimidating, he had never thought of them as something to fear. One day you'll understand, Jason, Sir Galen said with a wink. And when the time comes, be warned. They are very manipulative beings. Best not to underestimate them. Jason was still confused, but chose not to press further. He had a feeling that asking more questions wouldn't bring him any closer to understanding. He simply nodded, dismissing the strange remark. Come on, Jason, Sir Galen said, leading the way toward the exit. Let's go over the basics of riding again. It's your weak point after all. Yes, sir, Jason replied, enthusiasm returning as he followed Sir Galen to the stables. The tournament was on the horizon, and there was still much to prepare for. But for now, he would focus on the task at hand, pushing the uncertainties and the weight of his new responsibilities aside, if only for a while.